Not every loss is loud. Some losses arrive quietly and stay forever. And when a genuinely good man walks away, the world does not shake, but something inside does. This is not about love stories. This is about psychology, emotional consequence, and the silent fears that surface only after damage is done. Here are the 3 things most feared after a good man is hurt and gone. The fear of irreplaceable loss, the fear of emotional accountability, the fear of permanent regret. A good man does not announce his value. It is discovered slowly in the way he shows up, in the way he stays consistent, in the way he protects peace without being asked. While the relationship exists, that value often feels ordinary. Familiarity disguises rarity. Stability feels predictable, loyalty feels expected. Only after the connection is damaged and distance appears does the true weight of what was lost begin to surface. At first, the absence feels manageable. Life continues, routines remain, and distractions soften the edges. But as time moves forward, the mind begins comparing every new experience to the one that ended. Conversations start to feel shallower, effort feels inconsistent, emotional safety feels uncertain, without consciously trying. The memory of that good man becomes the measuring stick for everything that follows. That is when the quiet fear begins to form. The fear is not simply loneliness. It is the realization that something rare may have been permanently removed from life. Not all connections offer genuine respect, emotional security, patience, and commitment in the same package. When those qualities were once present and are no longer available, the heart starts to recognize that the loss is not just emotional, but existential. It is the fear that what once existed cannot be recreated, no matter how many new faces appear. This awareness creates an internal tension. The mind replays moments that once felt insignificant. Simple gestures, steady support, quiet understanding, consistent presence. They now carry new meaning because they are missing. The nervous system recognizes the difference between temporary excitement and lasting stability. What once felt predictable now feels priceless. And then comes the more painful realization. The good man did not leave because of chance or circumstance, but because the emotional environment became unsafe for him. That understanding transforms the loss from something unfortunate into something deeply personal. It is no longer just a breakup. It becomes a self-created absence. With that realization comes a heavy question that echoes in silence. What if that was the best version of connection that would ever appear? The mind does not easily accept that possibility. Yet it cannot escape it either, because real goodness is not common, and people capable of offering consistent love, loyalty, and emotional maturity do not appear endlessly. So the fear grows quietly. It appears in late nights, in moments of reflection, in sudden comparison, in the uneasy awareness that what was once available is now unreachable. No message can undo the damage. No apology can restore the same dynamic. Time has shifted everything. The deepest part of the fear is knowing that the loss is permanent, not because reconciliation is impossible, but because the version of the relationship that once existed no longer exists. Trust does not return to its original form. Innocence is gone. And once a good man emotionally detaches, the space he leaves behind cannot be filled by anyone else in quite the same way. That is the true weight of irreplaceable loss. Not heartbreak, not loneliness, but the understanding that something rare was held, misjudged, and released. And now life must continue with that knowledge. At first, it feels easier to avoid the truth. The mind looks for explanations that soften the damage, stories that protect the ego, reasons that make the loss feel less personal. Responsibility gets blurred, blame becomes shared. Justifications become comfortable. This stage offers temporary relief, but it never lasts because the emotional system eventually demands honesty. As time creates distance from the situation, the noise begins to fade. Without constant arguments, messages, or emotional tension, clarity emerges. The heart starts recognizing patterns that were invisible before. Certain reactions, words, choices, and behaviors that once felt justified begin to look different. What seemed normal under emotional pressure now feels questionable in calm reflection. This is where accountability becomes unavoidable. The realization slowly forms that the good man did not withdraw because of fate or misunderstanding, but because the emotional environment became unsustainable. The relationship did not collapse from one moment. It eroded from repeated choices, small dismissals, unmet needs, broken trust, and unaddressed wounds. And with that realization comes an uncomfortable truth: the damage was not accidental, it was created. That awareness carries weight. It challenges self-image. It forces the mind to confront uncomfortable questions about emotional habits, communication patterns, and personal boundaries. It becomes impossible to maintain the story of being the victim when the evidence begins pointing inward. And this is what makes accountability so frightening. It strips away the comfort of external blame. There is no one left to fault, no circumstances to hide behind, no narrative that preserves innocence. only the recognition that personal decisions shape the outcome. Once that truth is accepted, it cannot be undone. Every memory becomes sharper. Conversations replay with new meaning. Moments that once seemed small now reveal how deeply they mattered. The mind recognizes how certain words, reactions, and silences contributed to the slow unraveling of something stable and rare. This awareness is not loud or dramatic, it is quiet and heavy. It appears during ordinary moments while driving, while lying awake at night, while watching others experience the kind of connection that once existed. And in those moments, the full emotional cost becomes clear. The fear does not come from the past itself, but from what it says about the future, because accountability demands growth, it demands change, it demands confronting personal flaws without excuses, and that level of honesty is uncomfortable. It exposes insecurities, unresolved wounds, and emotional immaturity that once went unnoticed. There is also a deeper layer to this fear, knowing that even if growth happens, the opportunity that triggered the awakening is already gone. The lesson arrives after the loss, the awareness arrives after the damage, the clarity arrives after the door has closed. This creates a painful paradox. The person becomes emotionally wiser precisely because of the mistake, but that wisdom cannot be applied to the relationship that inspired it. And the mind is left holding both the knowledge and the consequence at the same time. This is why accountability feels so heavy. It is not just admitting fault. It is carrying the understanding of what was lost, why it was lost, and knowing that nothing can fully undo it. Regret does not arrive all at once. It develops slowly, often after the emotions settle and the distractions fade. In the beginning, life feels lighter without the weight of conflict or emotional responsibility. Freedom feels refreshing. Silence feels peaceful. The absence of emotional tension is mistaken for healing. But beneath that surface calm, something deeper is forming. As time moves forward, the mind begins revisiting the past. Small moments return with new meaning. Conversations once forgotten start echoing. Choices that felt reasonable at the time begin to look different. What once seemed insignificant becomes heavy with consequence. This is when regret starts to take shape, not as pain, but as awareness. It appears quietly during ordinary moments. While scrolling through memories, while sitting alone in familiar places, while watching others experience stability, affection, and commitment. The heart begins comparing what is with what once was, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Regret grows when reality fails to match the memory of what was lost. New connections feel uncertain, trust feels fragile, consistency feels rare. And the mind recognizes that what once existed was not common, it was something rare and deeply meaningful, even if that meaning was not fully appreciated at the time. The most painful part of regret is not missing the person, but missing the version of life that existed with them. The shared routines, the sense of emotional safety, the feeling of being understood without explanation, those experiences cannot be recreated in the same way. They belong to a specific moment with a specific connection under specific circumstances. Once broken, that chapter closes forever. As this realization deepens, the mind begins asking difficult questions. What if that was the best version of connection that would ever exist? What if nothing else will ever feel as stable, as genuine, or as real? These questions do not always have answers, but they remain quietly shaping every emotional decision that follows. Regret becomes heavier when the future fails to offer something equal. Each disappointment, each broken expectation, each failed attempt at rebuilding reinforces the memory of what was lost. The past begins to feel like a standard that nothing else reaches. There is also a fear beneath the regret, the fear that the damage cannot be undone. No amount of reflection, growth, or emotional maturity can return things to the way they were. Trust does not reset, time does not rewind, and the mind is forced to accept that some mistakes permanently alter the direction of life. This acceptance creates a deep emotional ache, not sharp or dramatic, but constant and quiet. It shows up in late nights, in long drives. In moments when the world slows down enough for the thoughts to surface, it becomes the awareness that the opportunity was real, the loss was avoidable, and the consequences are lasting. That is the weight of permanent regret. Not sadness, not heartbreak, but the understanding that something deeply valuable was held, mishandled, and released. And now life must continue with that knowledge. Comparison begins subtly. It is not intentional at first, and it is rarely conscious. It happens in moments of conversation, in the tone of someone's voice, in the way effort is shown or withheld. Without realizing it, the mind starts measuring everything new against what once existed. This is not nostalgia. It is psychological calibration. Once the nervous system has experienced a certain level of safety, care, and consistency, it cannot forget it. At the beginning of a new connection, excitement can temporarily hide the difference. Novelty creates stimulation. Attention feels flattering. Possibility feels intoxicating. But over time, the emotional system starts noticing what is missing. Small things stand out. Reliability feels inconsistent. Emotional depth feels limited. Presence feels conditional. And the memory of the past begins to grow stronger, not because it was perfect, but because it was stable. The comparison becomes unavoidable. Simple gestures from the present are silently weighed against memories from the past. A delayed response triggers the memory of immediate reassurance. Emotional distance highlights the contrast with steady presence. Moments of misunderstanding recall long conversations that once brought clarity and calm. Each difference reinforces the same realization. What was once available is no longer present in the same way. This creates a quiet internal conflict. On the surface, life continues, new routines form, new faces appear, but internally, the heart remains anchored to an old standard, not out of attachment, but out of recognition. The mind understands what genuine care looks like now. It understands what emotional safety feels like. It understands the difference between attention and commitment. The past becomes a silent benchmark, and this benchmark makes settling nearly impossible. Every new connection feels compared before it has a chance to grow. Every flaw feels heavier because it is measured against a memory that represents emotional security. The heart becomes cautious, not because of fear of intimacy, but because it has already experienced something rare and does not want to lose it again. The most painful part of this process is realizing that the comparison is not unfair, it is not unrealistic, it is not idealistic, it is simply based on lived experience. The mind is not imagining what a healthy connection looks like, it has already lived it. This creates another layer of loss. It is not only the loss of the person, but the loss of ease. Relationships no longer feel simple. Trust requires more time. Emotional investment feels heavier. Every decision is filtered through the memory of what once worked and what once felt right. The fear underneath all of this is quiet but powerful. What if nothing ever matches that standard again? What if that level of connection, loyalty, and understanding was a once in a lifetime experience? What if the heart has already seen the best it will ever see? That question does not always have an answer, but it changes how everything is felt. Comparison reshapes expectations. It sharpens perception, it makes emotional shortcuts impossible. The heart becomes both wiser and more vulnerable at the same time. This is the collapse of innocence in relationships. Once the mind knows what true stability looks like, it can never unknow it. And every new connection is forever measured against that memory. Control often feels invisible while it is present. It hides in familiarity, in predictability, in the belief that the connection will always remain accessible. When a good man is still emotionally invested, there is a sense of stability that can easily be mistaken for permanence. The relationship feels secure enough to take for granted. Boundaries feel flexible. Consequences feel distant. The idea that the connection could truly disappear does not seem real. Then one day, the dynamic shifts, the messages become shorter, the warmth fades, the emotional availability withdraws. What once felt stable becomes uncertain, and for the first time, the illusion of control begins to collapse. This shift creates an unexpected emotional response. It is not simply sadness. It is the realization that influence over the relationship is gone. The person who once remained steady no longer responds in the same way. Efforts to reconnect feel ineffective. Words that once carried weight now feel hollow. The sense of emotional leverage that once existed has vanished. That loss of control is deeply unsettling. It forces the mind to confront a new reality. Another human being cannot be managed, persuaded, or emotionally guided once detachment has occurred. A good man does not leave impulsively. He leaves after reflection, after emotional exhaustion, after deciding that his peace matters more than persistence. And when that decision is made, it is rarely reversed. The collapse of control becomes even more painful because of the timing. It arrives too late. It appears only after the consequences are irreversible. The opportunity to influence outcomes has already passed. What remains is awareness and helplessness at the same time. This creates a powerful internal conflict. The mind wants to fix what is broken, but the emotional authority to do so is gone. Attempts to regain connection feel like reaching for something that no longer exists. The relationship dynamic has shifted permanently. This is where the deepest fear emerges. The recognition that the outcome is no longer in one's hands. When the future of the connection was once predictable, life felt safer. There was comfort in knowing where things stood. The collapse of that certainty introduces emotional instability. The heart struggles with the absence of familiar ground. The nervous system searches for something to hold on to but finds nothing solid. The awareness that someone can choose to walk away completely without anger or conflict is profoundly destabilizing. It challenges assumptions about permanence, influence, and emotional security. The mind realizes that no amount of emotion can control another person's boundaries once they are firmly set. This loss of control also exposes a deeper truth: the connection was not guaranteed. It was a privilege sustained by mutual effort and emotional respect. When that respect breaks, so does the illusion of stability. The collapse of control forces growth, but it arrives with pain. It teaches that love is not possession, that presence is not permanent, and that emotional access must be protected carefully. The lesson is costly because it is learned through loss. What remains is the quiet understanding that some doors once closed do not reopen, and no amount of wanting can change that. There comes a moment, often long after everything has ended, when the noise finally disappears. No more arguments, no more emotional reactions, no more defensive explanations, just silence. And in that silence, something unavoidable begins to rise. The truth about oneself. Without the distraction of the relationship, the mind starts turning inward. Patterns become visible. Reactions that once felt justified now appear emotional. Certain words, behaviors, and choices replay with new clarity. What was once blamed on circumstances is now recognized as personal habit. This is the moment of inner confrontation. It is uncomfortable because it removes every mask. The mind is forced to acknowledge emotional wounds that were never addressed, insecurities that shaped behavior, and fears that quietly control decisions. The narrative of being right or wrong fades, replaced by a deeper awareness of how personal history, unresolved pain, and emotional immaturity influenced everything that happened. This confrontation is not about guilt, it is about understanding. The heart begins recognizing that love alone was never the problem. The problem was the internal world that shaped how love was given, received, protected, or damaged. The patterns that once felt automatic now appear chosen. The emotional habits that once felt natural now reveal their consequences. There is also a sobering realization that the good man did not simply walk away from the relationship. He walked away from the emotional environment that could no longer support him. That understanding reframes everything. It is no longer about who left whom, but about what was created between two people and why it became unsustainable. This awareness is both painful and transformative. Painful because it exposes uncomfortable truths about personal responsibility. Transformative because it offers something that cannot be found anywhere else: clarity. With clarity comes growth, but growth does not erase the past, it simply changes the future. And that is where the deepest conflict lies. The mind now knows what must change, but the relationship that revealed these truths no longer exists. The lesson arrives too late to save what inspired it. This creates a heavy emotional paradox, becoming stronger because of the loss, while still carrying the consequences of it. The confrontation with inner truth reshapes identity. Emotional boundaries become clearer. Communication becomes more conscious. Self-awareness becomes sharper. The person that emerges from this process is not the same as before. They are more reflective, more cautious, more intentional. But that version of self never had the chance to exist within the relationship that mattered most. That realization lingers. There is a quiet grief in knowing that growth came out of the damage. That understanding came after the loss. That emotional maturity arrived after the opportunity passed. Yet this confrontation is also the beginning of something new. It marks the end of emotional blindness and the start of self-leadership. The person who emerges is no longer guided by unconscious patterns, but by awareness and intention. The truth, once seen, cannot be unseen, and that truth becomes the foundation for every future connection.